subject of today is how to combine green sustainability with financial sustainability, with Diana Raiselis, who's going to present and then discuss with us. We're going to have about 20 minutes presentation, and then we're going to have a long time for discussion until the end, which is 5:30. So we'll have plenty of time to discuss and to exchange between each other. So today, how clubs are dealing with financial and green sustainability at the same time. Today we will get inspired by the nightlife industry to find new revenue streams in time of crisis while keeping the focus on green sustainability. Diana Raiselis, who is our guest today, is a research fellow in residence with the Berlin Clubcommission and VibeLab as a 2019-20 German Chancellor Fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Her work focuses on how nightlife culture contributes to sustainable cities, and particularly how collaboration between public, private, and civil society actors can support thriving nightlife. Previously, Diana has designed and facilitated civic and leadership development programs for nonprofit in Chicago and California, and developed new plays as a director and producer in Chicago's vibrant theater scene. She holds a degree in theater and civic engagement from Northwestern University, and has also completed fellowships with Steppenwolf Theater Company in Chicago and the Coro Fellowship in Public Affairs in Los Angeles. She is a founding member of the Los Angeles Nightlife Alliance. On that note, Diana, you have the mic. It's over to you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's lovely to meet all of you. I'm really excited about this format and that we'll have some time to really talk and dive into what you're feeling curious about, challenged by right now, and have a little bit of exchange between two different slices of the cultural industries that I think don't often speak so much with each other. So let me share my screen first. And can folks give me a little thumbs up if that works for them and they can see it? Fabulous. Okay, so as Maxi mentioned, I am finishing up a research fellowship with the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. I'm based currently in Berlin, but my previous home bases have been in Los Angeles, working in nightlife advocacy, and in Chicago's storefront theater scene and regional theater scene as well. So I'm excited to sort of bridge and make some connections between different aspects of our cultural discussions, because I know we're facing a lot of similar challenges. So today we're diving into this big question of how to combine green sustainability and environmental, economic, and social sustainability all together, which is an ambitious task, I know. And so in the past days, I've been reflecting a bit on kind of three key themes that I think maybe can inform today's discussion around the power of networks, especially informal networks, of taking local action, and of the role of artistic spaces in putting forth ambitious visions, in beginning to think about sustainability. I also have a tendency to talk fast, so please feel free to give a wave or put something in the chat if I'm skipping steps. But today I'll talk for a few minutes about what nightlife advocacy is and some of the current efforts that are going on in our field. And then I'll share two really brief case studies coming from a club and from a festival that are doing some environmental sustainability work in different ways. And then I'm excited to dive into discussion with you. And please feel free to put things in the chat throughout. We can gather up some questions as we go. And let me make sure I'm able to view that as we're going. Fantastic. All right, nice. So can folks give me a little, like, if you've got your camera on, thumbs up, middle, down, or if in the chat, if nightlife advocacy is something you know about, or if it means something to you, or if this is totally new. Thumbs up for I'm an expert, thumbs down if I have no idea what you're talking about. Okay. Okay, cool. All right, let's start from the beginning. So I want to offer a definition today for first the nighttime economy. So the nighttime economy, or the NTE, is broadly defined, and there isn't necessarily an agreement, but all the social, cultural, and economic activities that take place in a city from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Some folks define this as what comes after 9 p.m. Some people define it more tightly, but working with that definition today. So anytime that a museum does evening or late night programming, all the bars, clubs, transit operators, shops, supermarkets, it's all part of the nighttime economy. But we're focusing particularly on one slice of it, of nightlife culture and community. And so there isn't a definition for this, but I'd like to offer for today the artistic, communal, and cultural activities that take place at night in traditional culture venues like museums or theaters or operas, as well as bars, clubs, and informal spaces, all of which together enable identity formation and community building in addition to entertainment. And so this is sort of the crux of nightlife advocacy and the work that I do, because while cultural activities happening in formal spaces are often well measured, well documented, cities may have numbers about economic impact of their culture or creative economies. Often what happens in bars or clubs or DIY spaces or pop-ups is not part of that equation. And that can tend to fall through the cracks between thinking about bars and restaurants economy and culture. And so part of this is bridging the gap between these different aspects of cultural scenes in cities. And so this has happened in a number of different ways in different cities around the world and has begun to sort of take on a movement in informal network quality. And so this first started with Berlin Clubcommission, was the first organization to advocate for nightlife or sort of organize nightlife in a city starting in 2001. And since then, it has really blossomed into a number of cities. And you can see to the left here, a recent paper in 2019 by the nighttime scholar Andrina Cejas and the former night mayor of Amsterdam, Mirek Milan. And don't worry, I'll send links to all these things after the talk. So feel free to take notes, but we'll make sure that you have access to everything I talk about today. But the two of them mapped how many different cities have some kind of night mayor or nighttime advocate or night governance. And they take a number of different forms. So for example, in New York City, there's a formal office of nightlife that's part of its city government. But how many of you are in Vilnius? Okay, oh good. There's a Vilnius Night Alliance, which is a sort of informal NGO. I see nodding heads, so maybe some of you have interacted with them. So it takes a number of different models. But this to me is one of the first really important pieces of how we think about the value of informal networks. Because there isn't a trade association or a formal alliance of night mayors worldwide. What there is Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups and so on, which have proven to be really, really important, especially during this pandemic, as a lot of cities are dealing with the same questions of curfews, of advocating for cultural spaces as being safe, as we were talking about earlier with the question of lockdowns. So that is sort of the context from which I'm speaking. So I helped to start the nonprofit Los Angeles Nightlife Alliance out in LA and came to Berlin to look at sort of the similarities and what we can learn from one another. And so I'll mention also just very briefly the creative footprint, which is another effort to measure cultural scenes of cities, including these less visible or less formal parts, looking at music, but in a way that's not just looking at the dollar value of how much money a city's music scene makes. So looking also at measures of cultural innovation, looking at its framework conditions or how easy it is to start something in a city, looking at how well connected to transit it is. And so that tries to answer what I think is a really important question of there's not often a lot of data. And so we may not have a baseline for being able to evaluate the quality of a cultural scene or be able to make smart interventions. So I'll direct you to the Creative Footprint website. I won't say more here for time's sake, but I'll pivot ourselves into thinking a bit more specifically about sustainability in nightlife. There's often this sort of dichotomy perceived between nighttime economies and sustainable activity. So part of my work has been looking for where those things are already connecting or where we have assets that maybe we don't already know about. I will come back to this later. This is a little bit of a thought about what we're currently doing in the pandemic, called the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan. Looking at ways, again, to sort of answer these questions of, we're all going through similar challenges. How do we deal with open air events? How do we think about virtual events smartly, or planning for 24-hour economies and so on? There's also a case study of Vilnius in the first chapter. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But how many folks are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN SDGs? I got a yes, a nod. Okay, cool. So I was really shocked when I first read the SDGs, and I realized that they never mentioned the word night once. I went through, of the 15,000 words, there wasn't anything. And I think arts and culture is really sort of maybe undervalued in this discussion as a means to get to sustainability. And so one of the things I've been working on with my team has been looking for those existing points of entry. And so when I look at existing initiatives that are going on in the nightlife space, they break into sort of 5 of these thematic groups. And these, to me, when we think from an asset-based perspective, what do we already have? Where can we contribute to the conversation? So for example, the SDG relating to health and well-being, there's already nonprofits that are talking about mental health, that are providing services around safer sex or substance use, that are thinking about putting on safer events. And I think that's only going to become more important, of course, during COVID as that continues. Another theme around gender equality and social inclusion. And then primarily today, what we're talking about is sustainable resource usage. So the fact that there are already groups talking and thinking about this that are mapping the carbon footprint of DJs flying around the world, that provides, I think, a really important starting point that we then have to bridge into having all the same conversation. You know, I think it is not necessarily true that folks advocating for equal representation of female artists are thinking of themselves as related to people advocating for safer transit at night in cities. And so for me, thinking holistically about the sustainability conversation is what we're all doing together. So I want to get into 2 of the case studies here. And so I'm thinking today to introduce both a club and a festival. And that's because Jacob Billabel, who runs the Green Music Initiative, puts it really beautifully, I think. He talks about clubs tend to stay 80% the same, and 20% of their programs or their way of doing things changes. While for festivals, 80% of what they do year to year might change, and then 20% of that DNA stays the same. So I'm really interested to hear when we get talking after this short input, what parts of your infrastructure and your work are kind of like those 2 halves of the 80-20. And so for this club, changed a lot of its kind of hard infrastructure behind the scenes for sustainability. So I'll mention that today. So for those who are not familiar, Schwuz is Berlin's oldest LGBTQ club. It's existed since 1977 in various configurations. And in its current space, it's in a former brewery in Neukölln, where it's been for about 7 years now. And so they have a pretty big reach. They do about 260 events per year. They have about 110,000 visitors. And they've been a really important piece of LGBTQ infrastructure in the city for a number of years. Their group sort of gave rise to the first Pride events in Berlin and across Germany, as well as health infrastructure exists because of them too. And so I say that to say that their green sustainability is in context of understanding themselves as a really important piece of social infrastructure for the city and for their community. And so Schwuz, over the last couple of years, went through an energy audit process. I don't know how much this is lined up with your projects, but this is pretty infrastructure focused. So they partnered with Clubcommission and Friends of the Earth Germany and a number of other partners through the Clubtopia initiative, and did a full audit of their power usage, heating, light, water, so on and so forth, to understand where they were doing things well and where there was room for improvement. So I think this is another example of that, gathering the data so we can act smartly. And so what they found, and I'll just get into this briefly, was that they were already doing pretty well around water saving measures. So things like taps that were timed or waterless urinals. They had already started switching over to LED fixtures from conventional lights, but the audit encouraged them to switch energy providers, saving them a pretty significant chunk of their carbon footprint year to year by just switching to a green energy. But they also coupled that with some more on-site tweaks of their heating and cooling, of a simple change like moving an ice maker allowed them to use less power heating and cooling. So some simple small fixes that didn't necessarily cost anything and actually saved them money. And to me, one of the most interesting things about this example, I didn't really know that for many bars and clubs, their refrigerators are the biggest energy suck. That heating can come down once the dance floor naturally heats up, for example. But because refrigerators are often given by beverage sponsors, they may not be the most energy friendly model. And so this to me is really curious of what changes are best made on an individual club level versus what changes maybe could be advocated across a cultural scene to encourage a beverage manufacturer perhaps to think about more energy efficient refrigerators. But this is something that might not have occurred to me, for example, without having gone through a process like this. So that's, and I mentioned this the other day to Diane, this case study, and she said, oh, I had no idea that Schwartz had done something like this. So it's not a part of their branding. They don't lead with saying that they're a green venue or that they're sustainable. This is simply part of their feelings of how to be of value as a community institution. And so I'm interested to hear from all of you about how your sustainability efforts at your institutions either are something that you front and center, that you share with visitors, or that it's just something that's happening behind the scenes. And so switching over briefly to the festival example, I am delighted to have had a reason to learn about a new festival in preparing to speak with you all. So I learned recently that the Yaga Festival, which takes place outside of Vilnius each year since 2003, was one of the first in the region to do really simple waste lowering techniques like operating a deposit system or a bottle return system at its bars, or making sure to distribute pocket ashtrays so that their guests' cigarette butts don't pollute the local groundwater and the space that they're in out in nature. But I think in keeping with this idea of festivals or events being an opportunity to build sequentially on the work that came before, Yaga is moving this year towards some bigger moves like using no disposables whatsoever at the festival, which for a multi-day camping festival is a big deal. And so they're working to gather more data to understand how that's impacting their carbon footprint, their waste footprint, and so on. But one of the really big discussions right now in nightlife is also how we address this tendency to fly artists and fly as patrons too around the world, which is an especially carbon intensive activity. And so this festival for the first time this year is playing with a sort of budget of flights that each programmer for the festival has a certain number of artists that they're able to book who need to fly. And then beyond that, need to focus more regionally to artists that can come via non-airplane involving methods. And so I'm really interested, this to me was a great example of taking a very general conversation. We all know that we need to fly less and turning it into a really clear policy. And I'm interested to see how this plays out this summer, because I would be curious to see if other festivals might adopt this. And I think this might also speak to a bigger paradigm shift of thinking really local and figuring out how to invest deeply in local scenes, which also is offering us maybe more pandemic resilience at the same time when borders are closed or when travel limitations exist, as it seems like that might be true in the year to come and perhaps beyond. So I know we threw a lot of things at you, And I'm fighting the impulse to I want to tell you everything I know in 20 minutes, but I'll leave this up for a moment. Just some of the key themes to maybe use as jumping off points in conversation today. So thinking about this long-term versus short-term timelines, so more infrastructural versus more sprint or events. Thinking about sustainability in the big picture so that our green sustainability sits alongside measures like equal pay, like accessibility, like transit, and so on. Thinking about this question of how we can be creative and we can be frugal in getting data that we don't yet have. And then figuring out also how to share what worked and what didn't within the informal networks that we build. And I think this network especially is a really good example of that. And so valuing our informal scenes, valuing the text conversations we have with colleagues, or just informal ways of sharing information just as much as the formal. And finally, just this idea that I really want to celebrate of cultural institutions having a place in this sustainability discussion, that we may not be experts with solar panels, or we may not have the technical expertise to feel at ease in this discussion, but I think the role of artists in being imaginative, in holding space for emotional and intellectual discussions about possible futures is really, really powerful. And so I've written here collaboration, expression, and design, because I think those are three artistic capacities that translate beyond the work we do as artists in the studio or in the rehearsal room to really, really important and necessary capacities in discussions about sustainability and other ambitious future agendas. So I will close with a quote that I love from another Berlin club called About Blank. In their welcome statement, they put it, "Our goal is not only to provide beautiful music in an appealing environment, but also an other, better world." So I think it's valuable to keep that vision in mind, that perhaps utopian, but that's what's animating what we're doing. So thank you. I will stop there. I will hand it back to Maxime, and I will open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you for the presentation. That was super interesting. Just a quick question on my side. You just mentioned on the slide before, cultural institutions as spaces of experimentation. Do you have an example that you find interesting of a cultural institution that experimented with nightlife and including sustainability in some kind of way?
Mm-hmm. I'll highlight, and I'm happy to send a link through this later. One of the initiatives that took place late this fall in Berlin, when we were not yet in lockdown again, was called the Tag der Clubkultur. And it was financially supported by the Berlin Senate, giving grants to different cultural institutions that applied. And they were encouraged to also welcome collectives or other groups that didn't necessarily have their own space. And they did all sorts of things. I think there were somewhere between 40 and 55 activations all around the city in all kinds of different locations. And I can really imagine that also having a sustainability aspect to it, that because that's a short-term activation, and that was also just a means of supporting cultural institutions in the pandemic, because I know that this is a really especially precarious time, that ideating around sustainability, that's an easy way, I think, to jumpstart something.
And in matter of the pandemic, the nightlife, the global recovery plan, what are the big points of this plan? How do clubs plan on opening again?
Let me skip back to that slide and I can talk a bit more about that. You can see my screen again?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So the GNRP is not the most beautiful acronym, but it communicates what it's about. We identified, and this is, we is a very broad and always evolving collective of artists, professionals, researchers, practitioners from several dozen cities. we identified early on, the editorial team, sort of 7 really key issues that felt particularly urgent. And so that's what's in those green bubbles on the right. So in the summer, especially, we were talking about open air nightlife and how to activate other physical spaces and what issues might come up around noise, around accessibility, potential conflicts residentially. We were looking at the future of dance floors. And I think that one also had a really strong sort of social inclusion and social sustainability focus to it, of thinking about equity and thinking about how to take a look at business practices as well, that as we were pivoting businesses, we also had to think about the experience of workers. And that's true with the coming chapter. Right now we're on sustaining our nightlife scenes 1, so looking at the experience of workers and mental health. But the final chapter, learning as we go, looking at data gathering, I think also is going to focus to some degree on measuring the sustainability and beginning to gather the data we need in order to make some of these necessary changes. I see a question here. Sustainable business model for a cultural institution. Yeah, it's in chapter 2 gets into that a little bit more because I think this pandemic rather struck at the heart of businesses that rely on people being close together. And I think we are in the moment now of exposing how vulnerable a lot of these business models actually were. And so we did watch some people and some businesses try totally different concepts to try to work around the new regulations. So in that chapter, there were festivals that usually were on land that moved onto rafts in the water to create more social distancing. Thanks, Maxine. Some folks partnered with other businesses. The Village Underground, for example, in London became a cycle park because they had very desirable real estate for bike commuters coming into the city. And so they became a cycle repair shop briefly for part of their time. And so I think right now we've seen a lot of folks be very responsive and have to be reactive, unfortunately, because the restrictions do keep changing. And I do hope, there's been a lot of conversation I've followed in the theater world about more sustainable practices for workers, like getting rid of particularly long rehearsal periods that are customary in the theater world, but that are not so conducive to parent schedules, for example. But I think we haven't necessarily come up with the formula just yet, unfortunately. And so I think it's many small changes and many questions rather than any one particular business model. I know that's a bit of a Weasley answer, perhaps.
Awesome, thank you very much, Diana. Does anybody else has a question? Otherwise, I still have questions.
I'd actually love to turn that last question around to any of you of what feels like aspects of sustainable business models for cultural institutions. Because I think it's easy to point out what is unsustainable. And I think that 2020 was a lot about pointing out what was unsustainable for artists not receiving their royalties, for example, that they were due in the music world, thinking about representation, the sort of winner-take-all economy. So I'm curious to hear what's giving you all hope, or what you'd like to see industries moving more towards.
Does anybody from the Museum Facing Extension program wants to jump in?
Maybe we leave that open to continue to explore today.
Well, listening to you during your presentation, I really was trying to think a lot about museums and how museums can be inspired by the nightlife sustainability projects and how the nightlife is organizing the future, and how to build bridges between what the nightlife is doing and what museums will be doing or can do. And I think it might be a struggle actually to see how we can apply sustainability from the nightlife to museums. And I think it's a matter of understanding that it's a matter of seeing museums differently and see that museums can be spaces for nightlife or can be spaces for, if the nightlife is after 6 p.m., of course, museum can organize events after 6 p.m. And be part of the nightlife of a city, as well as cultural institutions during the day, and can have different roles in the city and in the neighborhoods. And I think it's interesting to just try to just put ourselves in a different position as maybe nightlife event planners, so to speak, instead of curators or audience engagement or stuff like that. And I think it's interesting, and I think we should maybe, I think nightlife event spaces are not spaces that museums think about a lot when they want to think of partners. When they think of partners, they don't think of clubs, and maybe they should think more of clubs and festivals.
Yeah, do you all perceive, when you think about sort of the museum sector or the museum subsector of culture, and you think about nightlife, do you see those things on opposite ends of a spectrum? Do you see an overlap between them? Like, I'm curious what your perception is. Because when I think about it, I think often about the sort of scrappiness of nightlife and how it often happens in cities in the sort of, in the margins or in the empty spaces, versus the sort of institutionalness of a lot of museums. But I know that's a kind of binary way to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it depends a lot. There's a lot of nightlife event organized in museums, but a lot of them are institutional, like exhibition opening, for example, which is kind of institutional. I know that some museum in London I know about. I'm sure we have other examples in other places, but a lot of museum examples are doing things that are a little bit fun with the nightlife, and they organize. I participated to in a silent disco in the Science Museum in London, so that was fun. And I'm French. In France, there's less things going in that direction, but that's very French. So I don't know. I think it depends, but I think there's an overlap, and I think there's a lot of experimentation that can happen in that overlap because it can also bring different audiences, and that's just a good thing, and that's interesting. We have a question in the chat. One of the similarities could be a perhaps renewed focus on the local AU turn in cases where the global has been the focus of programming, culturally inclusive.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this way in which I think we really share a similar concern, and one way which I think maybe we can learn from one another. That I do think there's a growing conversation in nightlife that it's possible that this moment of pandemic, this moment of sort of everything being stopped, might provide us the opportunity to reset and rethink this maybe over focus on international DJs. You know, there are certain DJs, maybe 50 or 100, who I will find the link for you all. An organization did, based on their resident advisor on their club listings, map their carbon footprint of each DJ. And okay, you know, long haul flights, folks who just a couple of international flights per year are seen as behavior that we may need to change. And so for people who are playing in different cities 250 nights of the year, it's extreme. And so that's one of the big conversations right now in the nightlife world about how do we reverse that focus and how do we really invest in our local scenes. And so there's this concept of the venue ladder, that a healthy cultural ecosystem in a city has the very small places or open mics for people to get a start. They have small venues where emerging artists might be booked, and then medium size and very large. And when there's a missing step in that ladder, that can result in sort of an unbalanced cultural scene. And so I wonder, for museums that are experimenting with late nights and may have different kinds of spaces to activate, from very small rooms to very large ones, how museums might be part of sort of bridging a gap in their city's potential cultural scene musically as well, and how your brand and your identity as your museum in particular might lend itself to certain kinds of partnerships in the city.
Yeah, what I think, but if anybody think differently, please say so. There's a lot of museums renting their spaces. So if you are a band or another company or whatever, you can rent the space and maybe do a concert. In my point of view, there's less museum actually organizing music event in their names and doing something as a museum, inviting the audience to listen to music. There's a space in Paris called La Gaieté Lyrique, which is an exhibition space plus a concert space plus I mean, they kind of do everything, and that's great because you can choose what you want to go and see. There's another space in Paris called 104, same kind of space, but we don't actually call them museum. We call them cultural spaces. Or so you can go and see an exhibition, you can go and read a book, you can go and dance and see a dance show. And we don't call them museum, and I think that's very interesting because in the museum spectrum, we don't expect, in the traditional sense, to have fun, and that's something that in my view, needs to be broken. But it's interesting.
Well, I would say that in Lithuania it's quite opposite, that
Okay.
museums, they don't rent the space for concerts. And well, at least in my museum, keeps the line that all events, like, I don't know, discussions, concerts, whatever, even theater maybe, is a part of their program, and they do kind of put a title of the museum with that event. So the problem, I would see that actually the spectrum of events in the museum is quite narrowed by this exhibition programming, or the view of the museum, what program should it take. So I think that's the problem. And when I think about my museum, which has 9 subdivisions in all Lithuania, so there are, for example, 2 subdivisions in the city center, in the heart of the city of Vilnius, but one of them could be a part of this nightlife, and it is during, for example, museum nights, till, I don't know, till early morning, but that's it. Yeah, well, but that would be nice for it to have the nightlife all the time, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking a bit about the kinds of activations that, for example, Kraftwerk in Berlin has brought fine art into its spaces through Rafik Anadol's installation was there in late 2019, and they've done some other sort of large scale and sometimes all night artistic installations. And so I think of those where maybe there's more high art or fine art invited into nightlife spaces, and thinking about perhaps some kind of exchange. I wonder what that might look like, or how that might create sort of an appetite for it to make it feel a bit less scary.
Do you have examples of nightlife spaces, clubs or other spaces that act as cultural institutions? I remember when a long time ago, like 10 years ago, when I was going to clubs a lot, there was sometimes clubs organizing exhibitions that you could actually see if you wanted to stop dancing, and you could go to the next space and just see an exhibition. Do you have examples of a few clubs that are cultural institution in a way?
You know, the first thing that comes to mind for me, I think of the Oasis Festival in Marrakech, for example, that along with programming, I think 3 festival stages, was also showcasing local fashion, local artwork from young designers and sort of different scenes across Morocco, and I think in other locations as well in Africa. So I think club culture is a multidisciplinary space of art, and there's all kinds of really lovely examples of, you know, the fashion and other sort of visual art that came out of the disco scene in Los Angeles, for example, in the like 70s and 80s. So I think that's really natural, that there's multidisciplinary things going on, that there's lighting or digital projection that's part of creating the space. There's a strand of scholarship of looking at club architecture and architects that got involved in creating the kind of architecture that people feel like they can disappear or lose themselves into. And so there's, yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. I'll find the link as well for Tag der Clubkultur, because I think a number of the events were, because they might not have been, it might not have been possible for dancing to happen, focused instead on visual art or other sorts of installation.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting, and I think I'm thinking right now of doing a museum/club, and we can hold party and see an exhibition in the morning. That would be cool. Does anybody has a comment or a question for Diana today? I was wondering, anybody here, I know that the museum facing extension participants are working all in museums. How is your museum experimenting with nightlife? Do you organize nightlife events? What type of events are you organizing?
Can you hear me? I'm a
Yes.
little bit, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So at Mo Museum, well, we have, when we opened the museum in 2018, we started with the Friday lates, which are quite common in museums in the UK, especially. So it's like a Friday event, which is in the evening with music and dancing and going to exhibitions and so on. But later during, you know, the time, we experienced that it's not that, it didn't gain popularity. And we figured that it's because in Lithuania, sort of art and fun are not perceived well together, you know, as something that can take place, you know, together. So we transformed it a little bit. But basically what we have realized is that whenever we invite into this kind of an event a musician that is very famous and very well known, then of course we have a lot of people. But when we invite like a more niche kind of people, more, you know, art world type of people, not popular in terms of like pop music, then the attendance of these Friday lates was much, much lower. So what we realized is that, you know, okay, a museum can hold concerts and we do rent venues for, you know, whatever purposes, and we do hold our own concerts. But when it comes to the late programming, it's not that the nightlife is not something that people are accustomed to happen in a museum. Well, at least for the time being.
Yes, go for it.
And I see that Aida Stanchiene wrote for all the museums, and really, that's right. We only have museum night, which ends at 12 o'clock. So at museum night, this is our event in Lithuania, where the museums are open until the late evening. But maybe I didn't understand right. I want to say about sustainability. because the nightlife requires much more electricity. Then you have to put on the music on the high level, and then I wonder, because if we do nightlife in museums, do we gain more sustainability then?
So I see today's discussion as maybe something of a triangle, that I think there's one sort of conversational thread of how do we maybe better integrate music and nightlife. And then also, you know, I was able to share a little bit of how sustainability and nightlife are going together, which I think is still in early days. And then I think figuring out how to get in the middle of that triangle is super, super interesting and challenging too. Because I think that I was going to mention that you all, in having museum spaces that have long leases, have a sort of experimental field of sustainable infrastructure thinking that we in the nightlife world may not. So for example, often clubs are in sort of a temporary use paradigm, and so their leases may only be a year long. They may not know when their property owner decides to, you know, call it a day and do something else with the space. And so many clubs, when they think about making sustainability upgrades, it doesn't make sense for them to make big built environment and sort of plant improvements, if that makes sense. Whereas if you all know as a museum that there's state support or that there's a 10-year lease, there's opportunities to invest in sort of longer term sustainability measures that will show more benefit over time. So in some ways, it's a bit of a funny thing of our downside is almost your upside. That I think there's probably space for playing with things like green roofs or thinking about solar, that, you know, we've been thinking and talking in sort of ideational ways in the nightlife world about how the physical spaces of clubs that are dormant during the day can be more of a part of the city's energy infrastructure. You know, could this play home or host to battery storage, to solar panels, things like that? Things have been tried of like a dance floor that gets storage from kinetic energy from being danced on. You know, there's these cool sort of avant-garde solutions. I don't think they found it to work yet in a genuinely power generating way. But in terms of something demonstrational or something that's almost as much an art installation and food for thought, those kind of out there ideas, I think, are worth partnering on or experimenting or celebrating. But I do think that, you know, where like nightlife is loves to be innovative and loves to invent things, and I think is really good at responding quickly to crisis or to change. And so I would be curious, for example, if doing some kind of partnership with local nightlife entity and even a local sustainability organization, doing a partnership that's triple rather than just double, because this is a field that we all are still learning into. That is there a way to persuasively communicate some piece of behavior change and to utilize the messaging from nightlife or use the platform that artists have to make something feel more desirable or hip.
Thank you so much. We have hands raised. Bella, I know that you've been raising your hand for quite a while now. If you want to jump in.
Oh, hi there. So I'm Bella from the Tate Gallery in London, and thank you, Diana. That was a really interesting presentation. For us, we do host a Tate late on a monthly basis, or we had to sort of pre-COVID times, and it's very much aimed at sort of 18 to 25-year-olds and making it a very non-scary place to come and visit. Taking the music, so we generally have DJs, open bar, places where you can go and eat, as well as visit some of the gallery spaces. For my role is very much on the sustainability side of things. So my concern is that we're inviting thousands of young people, and then we had all these disposables and things that weren't considered so sustainable. So it was great working with the Tate Late team. And we used it as an opportunity to sort of really engage with local breweries, for example, and sort of getting people to come in and people to try the local beers, and also locally produced food and things like that, and inviting some local poets or Londoners themselves to demonstrate some of their own sort of talents. And it was a great opportunity to showcase some of that really young local talent. So I think we took it as very much an opportunity to sort of engage with, obviously we engage with lots of international artists, but I think on a local level, and I think we did some sort of great networking and some great partnerships there. So I think it's, although in terms of sustainability, it's not always favoured as the most sustainable, but I think there's lots of opportunities there that music venues or definitely museums can take advantage of.
That's great to hear. Thank you. I think also this is one of the places where I wonder how inviting events that are already doing zero waste practices into physical spaces might also create sort of a capacity building opportunity. That I think festivals, especially those with a sort of leave no trace ethos, or that subscribe to the burner principles, like Burning Man, have maybe expertise in how to run zero waste or low waste events, and perhaps that's something that can be integrated into more event and institutional infrastructure for the long term, because I think that's something that festival and event folks maybe have figured out in a way that institutions don't yet.
Oh, I see that you have a hand raised. If you want to.
Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate more, or maybe for you to elaborate more, Diane, about one interesting thing that you mentioned, about how theaters are discussing to decrease rehearsal time so that their employees or the actors or the staff, could spend more time with their families. What do you think, for example, museums could be certain practices like that, like to be more sustainable in, terms of our employees and our, stakeholders?
I would have to turn that back around to you for the sort of industry specifics, but I can say a little bit more about what the thought has been in theater. I come out of the Chicago theater scene, and while there's some unionized theater work, a lot of it is non-union. And so I think because it's a competitive field, because people are freelancing, there's a lot of pressure to keep some work practices or some hours that when you step back and look at them, as we've had the opportunity to do in this pandemic, people sort of cock their heads and think, well, is this still the way we want to be doing business? Can we rethink what we call it in theater is a 10 out of 12. And so you work from maybe 10 to 10 that day with breaks taken throughout. And it's quite a traditional thing in mounting a theater production, but looking back at it for parents, for people working multiple jobs, can be really quite challenging, as is, for example, needing to get off of work on short notice in the middle of the day to go down to a commercial audition downtown, for example. And so I'd be curious to hear from all of you what things have maybe merited a second look in your industry that perhaps there can be some sort of collective agreement or discussion about, is this the way we want to do things?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's very little collective agreement so far, especially in terms of museum employees. I'm not sure, well, I come from a small museum in terms of employees, but maybe other larger museums have unions. I'm not even sure if they do. So that's interesting to know, how can we implement sustainable practices by ourselves? I mean, the organizations are sort of interested in that, but we don't really know what is the, what are the tools, what is the right practice here. Maybe we're doing everything right already.
I think spaces like this are a step towards that.
I would say that, I don't know, most museums in Lithuania are small in terms of employees. and those employees are I don't know, occupational, I would say. They do and this and that and that. And so, for example, I as educator have to be, well, in non-pandemic times, in the gallery in the morning for school children, and then in the evening for public events like evening events. So the sustainability of employees, I think it's a hard question for Lithuanian museums, because we have, I don't know, a big museum, for example, and still 50 workers all together with sanitary ladies and everything. So
Yeah, I think it's a big question on how an action on a museum can be have repercussion on other museums, and would they agree on doing something together? I think that's the challenge, actually. Ona, you still have your hand raised if you want to jump in.
No, sorry, I forgot
Okay.
to put it down.
You know, I'll mention also briefly, this initiative might be of interest to you all. There was an initiative developed in Chicago in the storefront scene, which again is not unionized and sort of not a formal association, but the organization was called Not in Our House. And this was something that arose after some pretty serious sexual misconduct and assault allegations came out of one theater. And so because it's not possible necessarily to organize, because there's not this was a totally voluntary effort of people getting together and articulating a sort of set of standards around working hours, around declaring, okay, if you know you're experiencing something as an artist part of a theater process, and you need someone to speak to, you know, every theater process will install sort of a trusted person to speak to, for example, and here is a complaint process. And this was something totally voluntary that theaters signed on to, that theaters said, we're going to follow the Not in Our House standards for this theater production, and so here's how we do this. And so that was something that was not a formal organization, was not unionization, but that was articulating some standards, I guess something similar to the Sustainability Development Goals, that provided just something to look to collectively. And I know that that's an ambitious thing to take on for a scene, but I wonder how adapting something like that, or even just a values articulation process, might be the start of something.
And in the nightlife scene, the clubs, are they unionized in any way?
No, so certain cities, for example, Clubcommission has around 300 members, so either member clubs or event collectives or individual artists who pay a certain fee to be part of, you know, accessing services through Clubcommission and so on. But Clubcommission itself does do, for example, awareness and inclusion and diversity work. And so there's not an effort to unionize per se, but I think creating those infrastructures for discussion, you know, to be a Clubcommission member and, you know, speak about issues that matter, vote in a board. It provides just a sense of organization or a place to go to talk about sort of certain issues in a club scene. Not everyone works this way, but I think this membership-based kind of organization is another way to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Diane just shared the Culture Declares Emergency, which, yeah, follow the same process and does the same thing. So.
And if I may, I actually think that the last thing that you said, Diana, about membership is actually still a question for the museum field, because, for instance, we had a discussion with Museums for Future last week. You know, the museum section of Fridays for Future, and most of the museum professionals actually being engaged in Fridays for Future and Museums for Future, they actually engage individually. So they cannot actually have institutional membership. They cannot ask their museums to actually pay for membership. They do it individually. And it's really, really difficult for them to, for many museums to actually say, okay, we support Fridays for Future. Exactly like Cultures Declares Emergency is actually behind Extinction Rebellion. So it's really tricky to really engage one institution. So individually, people are doing it, but then the next step is very, very hard to reach.
Yes, I recognize that it's a really complicated thing to, as a person inside of an institution, to speak sort of on behalf of an institution, or to sort of get power to do that. And so I recognize that all different scales of actions sort of have value, that if, you know, your purview or the place that you sort of have leverage in your institution is around purchasing, is around, you know, what kinds of paper towels are being bought, that is an action, just as the sort of curation and programming is, just as the event management, that I know that it's hard to move in all those directions perhaps at the same time.
I think what you are starting to draft is actually a map of what is available to us as individual, and then to us as a team, and then to us as a department, and then as a museum, and then maybe as a movement and as an international community. But at least if everyone could actually understand the different stages and everything that is possible, it could be already huge. But you need to be aware that at an individual level, you can already do a lot. Just, like you said, questioning a quote, saying, okay, maybe if I need to actually buy paper, maybe I don't want to buy this paper anymore. Maybe I will ask another quote so it's more green. And that's already a huge action. It could have a huge impact. I remember it was last week or 2 weeks ago, Cara and Bella, you were actually supporting her. You actually explained the impact of few decisions that these decisions add on the budget and on the carbon footprint of Tate. And this was super impressive. I couldn't believe that just one small action, just changing a provider, could actually have such an impact. But I can't remember it right. Bella, maybe you can remind us.
I'm trying to remember what we covered quite a lot, didn't we? But there, I mean, we at Tate, we have, I mean, we're really lucky that we have 1,000 members of staff, and I would say that 85% are hugely aware of our environmental sort of impact and really want to make those changes. So and supporting that, we have directors that are really on board. So we have a really active green team, which makes a huge difference to us. And it will be the tiniest things. I mean, for example, we have our working partners that are not Tate staff, but our housekeeping team. So we have a cleaning contractor in that does all of our cleaning. Well, at Tate, we have a coffee roastery. So we roast our own coffee, and the coffee beans come shipped in these hessium sacks that we historically had always thrown away. And the cleaning company now line our recycling bags with these hessium sacks. So we no longer change our dustbins on a daily basis, just picking up a plastic bag full of waste into a bin. We basically tip our waste into the hessium bags and reuse those hessium sacks. So we've literally saved thousands of single-use plastic bags. And it's all these tiny changes that we do, but because we are huge organizations that make a big impact, and we encourage that, and we literally have sort of requests coming on almost every other day from staff wanting to make, which almost seem like really insignificant changes, but actually on a grand scale of things make a huge difference. So, you know, I love sort of bumping into people when they're throwing away their tea bag into a general waste bin, and we've got a food recycling bin, and they always say that their sort of one argument is, oh, but I only have one tea a day. But yes, you're one person, but we have 1,000 members of staff. So if you add 1,000 tea bags on a daily basis, 7 days a week, that's a huge amount of waste. But no, we're really sort of fortunate in that respect, that we've got a really active staff as well as directors. So we're really able to push a lot of things through, and we have the backup. So yeah, I would encourage anything that you can do within your organization, no matter how small, it really has a real roll-on effect.
Yeah, I think that's, to me, why the first step of gathering data, and if an energy audit or an audit of behaviors, even an informal one, is possible in some way, because to know where you've begun and to know where a small change, like looking at the bags that are used for your waste stream, or looking at light fixtures, where those small changes maybe can have the most meaningful impact. Because I know that it's easy to talk a lot about, you know, changing straws or getting rid of straws, while there's maybe less daily visible changes that have a huge impact. So I appreciate that example. Thanks for bringing it up.
You mentioned the Schwutz club that does this kind of thing. Do you have other examples of clubs who have taken small action but have had an impact on their budget, on their I don't know, small action they can do something big in other clubs or other theaters? Or
That's what I'm working on gathering now. I was hoping to spend more of 2020 doing that, but things intervened, unfortunately. But I know that this organization and this partnership is ongoing, and so I hope that I'll have more examples to share and reflect back in the future.
Cool, thank you. Does anybody want to jump in?
If I can ask,
Yes.
if you know so far, what kinds of projects are you undertaking as part of this initiative? I'm really interested to hear, if you know yet.
Yes, absolutely. There's 4 teams, and they all work. So maybe the project might not be clearly defined yet, but they have challenges, so they know what they need to tackle. But I'd let them speak. So if Egle, Yogita, or anybody wants to answer that question.
Well, our challenge is like a question: is it possible to emerge in artwork as in nature? And we think about maybe all the senses or 5 elements of nature, like fire, water, air, and ground. And we are thinking about inviting people from science field to look at our collections in the museum and to talk about how those artworks reveal the climate change from in the beginning of 20th century till now. So it's quite still abstract in my mind, but the line is like this.
Does someone from another team wants to share the project with Diana?
Yeah. So we thought about, first of all, we thought about reusing materials that are used in exhibitions. But for that, we need a big database, more resources, and then if one city is away from another city 300 kilometers, so we have a CO2 emission higher, and so on and so on. So we have decided to make a group, a page, where we can share various ideas. For example, like today, where concrete ideas how to make more sustainable, I don't know, more sustainable everyday life. And I heard concrete ideas from Diana, from Bella, and those ideas has to be exchanged and maybe some new posted into this page. And so all first of all, we will be a small group, and then later, I hope that more and more museums will join this group.
So you're starting this alliance that we were talking about.
Sorry?
You're starting the alliance and the museum group that we were talking about just before. Yogita, are you working on something different, or are you part of one of the?
I'm part of the same group with Jurga. So our challenge was overcoming competition between museums. And as Jurga already mentioned, we are thinking about some kind of maybe a Facebook group or some kind of web page where we can invite museums to participate and to share ideas on many things, even on reusing the materials, or maybe sharing ideas on whatever, sharing information about some kind of new articles on overcoming competition and facing the climate change and other things. So we are still working on that idea, how it will come out.
Yeah, I know. So I know there's another group working on. I know Diane will be more precise on this than me. On reaching, no, on bringing, on something about teaching how to be sustainable to population and kids in particular.
I think it's a group working on different workshops to actually engage local communities in around the Anthropocene topic or in sustainable practices. It's actually, I see Aida and Vilte. I don't know if you're here as, but if you want to share what you're working on. It will be actually a series of workshops before a big exhibition happening in the VibeLab Palace of Art in Vilnius in September this year about the Anthropocene. And yeah, they're working on different workshops too. What I really like with this idea is actually that the group actually wants to decentralize the topic around climate change. So it's not just in Vilnius, it's not just happening in the big cities, but it's happening in all regions in Lithuania. So they really want to actually start the discussion around the topic during summer and then have a big exhibition in the VibeLab Palace in September. But correct me if I'm wrong, Vilte and Aida. Okay, I see a thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Yeah, but I'm actually really, really curious about this Facebook group that you will work on, Yogita and Jurga, like really dedicating Facebook group around circular economy and museums for Lithuanian museums. I think this is how you can actually start a really good community and share best practices. So we will help you. And yeah, that's a good way. That's the right way to do it, actually. Starting with a small group and then making it evolve naturally.
We have something. So I was just going to say we have something in London called Free Cycle, which there's two sort of versions. One is for the general public, and then there is one just for museums. So we generally, after an exhibition, if we've got plinths or specific museum type waste, we generally put it out on Free Cycle for museums, and 9 times out of 10 it is taken normally by local sort of creative groups, but you know, people with a lot less budgets, and they come along and collect it for free, which reduces obviously our cost for disposal as well as our waste streams, and that works really well. And it started off, I think, just with 1 or 2 museums, and there's probably, I don't know, maybe 60 or 70 all up and down the country, but it's museums and it's other charities and local independent creative groups. And I think it's definitely worth doing because it's really grown over the last couple of years. And I think we very rarely have to throw anything away now. You always find someone that will want what you've got for offer.
Thank you, Bella. Well, we still have a few minutes, so if anybody wants to jump in and share something about the project or ask a last question to Diana, it's now. Well, I'm personally interested in what you're doing with the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan, and I went on the website and I looked at the links, so there's a lot to read. What I found really interesting was the diversity of professionals working together, and you have on the website it says practitioners, academics, public health experts, advocates to work on the nightlife plan. Were there people working already with nightlife and or thinking about nightlife before, or they just were chosen because of their particularities to external? Yeah.
Thank you for bringing this up, because I also feel it important to mention we're putting out the 4th chapter around supporting nightlife workers and thinking about the needs of workers at night tomorrow. So you can have a visit after this or right now to nighttime.org/recovery plan. And if you put yourself on the mailing list, you will get the chapter and the future chapters as well. And we always hold a conversation after the release of each chapter. So we've got that coming up as well on February 10th. So 2 weeks from tomorrow. And those conversations, I've really appreciated them, because this project has attempted to build not just the knowledge base between different cities, but also the network. Thinking about, hearing you talk about developing a Facebook group or sort of developing spaces for this conversation, or even circular economy, I think that's such an important step of the process to working towards these bigger goals. And so who has taken part in the GNRP, I think it's been rather informal that there is a real interdisciplinarity. I've met a wonderful number of urban planners who are also DJs through this process. And so people often wear multiple hats, that their work in nightlife and their work around urban design or urban planning for them is sort of intertwined. And I really appreciate that. And this process, we've really attempted to create this sort of repository of not always best practice, because we don't know right now. It's too early to say what the best sustainable business models have been during this pandemic, I think long term. And so more just gathering practices and being able to provide resources. And because we know all these people in our networks, being able to connect people that want to try something to other organizations that are actually doing it. And so in the process of creating this most recent chapter, a local liquor company actually bailed out a venue that was at risk in a nearby city. And so I think there is this kind of iterative process that as we go to gather knowledge and try to document what's going on, things also happen. So it's not ever just research, it's also practice. And so I imagine and I suspect that when you all are beginning to sort of gather information about your sustainability practices in your various institutions, things will also happen as a result. That the relationships that get built, the conversations that get had will lead to new things, and to look for opportunities to sort of nudge that along. And so bottom line, come join us, nighttime.org/recovery plan, and save the afternoon time, sometime around the same time on February 10th. You'll get an email about it. And so part of that is also practice, that if you want to, thanks Diane, if you want to get involved in some way, if you have a space that you want to activate with some kind of nightlife project, if you're thinking we have assets or we have needs, let's connect. There is Vilnius Night Alliance, it's based in Vilnius. VibeLab is this consultancy that does work internationally. So there's ways to share this, all these knowledges and resources, and kind of keep this conversation going.
Well, thank you so much. That's an amazing word to finish this this meetup. So If nobody has any more questions, I think we'll wrap up on that note. That was perfect. Thank you very much. So thank you, Diana, for being here with us today. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you to the Museum Facing Extension participants. So this session has been recorded. We will post it online with a sum up and with the links provided by Diana very soon on the community. Feel free to share anything on the community. It's a space that is there for you and for us to discuss. Thank you very much, and we'll see you very soon online. And thank you, Diana.
You.
Sure.
Thank you.